Antiquity for the academic year 2022 to 2023. Our focus for papers this year will be on first principles, the Archae. And it is with great pleasure that I welcome two scholars today, whose papers I will have the pleasure of moderating, who are experts not only in the Archae, but the Archontes, the Archons, playing figures in Gnosticism. The first of our speakers is Zlatko Plese, who is well known to, I believe, to all of you. He studied at the University of Zagreb in the former Yugoslavia before coming to the United States to earn a PhD in classics at Yale University in 1996. He has an illustrious teaching career, having taught not only at Zagreb and at Yale, but also at Wesleyan, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where he is a full professor at the Department of Religious Studies, and also at the University of Bern in Switzerland, where he served as adjunct professor since 2018. His publications are manifold, focusing on many aspects of ancient Christianity, ancient Judaism, Gnosticism, and later Greek philosophy. But particularly well known are, of course, his revised and published dissertation, Poetics of the Gnostic Universe, Narrative and Cosmology in the Apocryphon of John, published in Nag Hammadi and Manichaean Studies in 2006, as well as his Apocryphal Gospels, co-edited and translated with Bart Ehrman, as well as the other Gospels, accounts of Jesus from outside the New Testament, an accompanying volume of scholarship. Zlatko has also authored many articles on Platonism, cosmology, and subjects as diverse as dualism, evil, oracles, and Plutarch, you name it, he's done it. He's a terrific speaker for us to have in this series, and it is with great pleasure then that I invite you, Zlatko, to begin to speak. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you all for coming to this session and also to my talk. And I will, as you know, as you have seen, the title of my talk is Archaeology of Gnosis on the Inner Life of the Gnostic First Principle. The talk examines I do have slides to share with you, just a moment. Just a second. My talk examines some Gnostic responses to one of the central issues of metaphysical monism, the emergence of reality from a self-contained unitary first principle. In the first section, I will focus on Plotinus, who, unlike the Gnostics, provides some programmatic statements about the method of approaching the problem. In the second part, I will briefly talk about the guiding analogies in the Gnostic discourse of the first principle and its tendency to condense and blend these analogies. So analogy looms large in my talk. I'm going to repeat these words much too often. In the final section, I will focus on the privileged and most controversial Gnostic analogy, one that describes the first principle beyond being and intellection as a self-searching absolute experiencing the same series of changing dispositions and affections as the mind of the developing human. The problem of the discourse appropriate to the transcendent first principle and of why and how it devolves into plurality was addressed and debated by other philosophical and religious currents open to Platonic influence. As you well known, probably the most important Plato's passage, in addition to the first two hypotheses about the one in the Parmenides, is the famous sun analogy from the 6th book of the Republic. 509 BC. In this passage, Plato qualifies the supreme principle as the form of the good, beyond all beings, superior to it in rank and power. Plato's pronouncement is an analogy projected from the visible world and the sense of sight to the intelligible world and the intellect. Just as the sun enables the sense of sight to see invisible things to be seen, so does the good enables the intellect to think and the intelligible things to be thought. Plato's analogy is an imaginative means of coming to think of the God, but like all analogies, it is suggestive and intuitive more than systematic and analytical, leaving some difficult questions unanswered. What is the sense Plato intends for the good? And in what ways is this good the ultimate cause of knowing and being? For Middle Platonist Alkinos, for example, the good is the primal intellect, very close to Aristotle's unmoved mover, which acts on the secondary intellect of the cosmos, I quote, while remaining itself unmoved, as does the sun on the vision, and as the object of desire moves desire. Other traditions, however, rejected identification with the intellect, eternally engaged in thinking of itself and its own thoughts. For the author of the second treatise of the Corpus Hermeticum, God is not the intellect because it would then be intelligible to himself, and therefore, I quote, different from itself as the object of his thought. Plotinus agrees. In his words, any act of thinking, even if self-reflective, implies the duality of thinking and what is thought. The first principle, in contrast, must be simple, self-sufficient, and indivisible, and therefore prior to thinking and have no need of thinking. To be sure, these two principal positions, one that the good is the transcendent intellect and the other that the first principle is beyond being and also beyond intellect, were not always clearly set apart or even considered mutually exclusive, as witnessed in Alexandrian Christianity and even in Gnostic traditions. These two positions also share some important things in common. For instance, the conviction that no predicate can adequately represent the divine nature, so-called via negativa. For Alkinos, the good, which he identifies with the primal intellect, is ineffable, but inasmuch as intellect, still graspable by intellection by way of abstraction, aphyresis, analogy, analogia, and preeminence, hyperoche. For Plotinus, on the other hand, the good is also ineffable and resists univocal predication. But in Plotinus' view, and this is crucial, the good, which he also calls the one, is beyond intellect and therefore beyond intellection. Plotinus, as I will now try to show, also employs Alkinos' three ways of conceiving God, yet he considers them to be approximative at best, intended to persuade rather than to demonstrate. Let me now move to Plotinus, to my second part of the talk. In a treatise that some scholars consider his manifest of positive theology, which is doubted by many others, we find the following assessment of our capacity to conceive and speak of the first principle. And here is the quote on my slide. Finally, here my slide comes in handy. So we have here the quote that I have to read. We transfer metapherontes to the good, lesser properties from lesser things because of incapacity to find what is appropriate to state about it. All the same, we could find nothing to say, not just what is predicable of it, but not even what is really about it. For all noble and majestic things come after it. For he himself is the principle of these, and yet in another way, not their principle. For us, indeed, everything is to be put away, apotichemenois. Being is his power as posterior and self-determination, too, for it already speaks of activity towards another. We must say then that he is altogether unrelated to anything, for he is what he is before them. For we even abstract the is, and so also any kind of relations to the intelligible beings. The passage provides Plotinus' standard position regarding the discourse of the one, approximative and asymptotic at best, even when we simultaneously apply the three ways of conceiving God recommended by Alkinos. You notice here this term aphiresis. He's also talking about hyperohe here, and also about via analogia or analogy, using the term metapherein. The passage, as Plotinus explains in the passage, we may start from what is familiar to us, or as he says, from lesser things, to, for instance, for what is in our power to do or not to do, and work our way through the levels of reality all the way to the top by abstracting aphirein, chance, necessity, and forced acts of the will in order to grasp the will of the one. Though this will is absolute, unpremeditated, and not conditioned by anything, because there is nothing prior to it to condition it and determine its choices. Or, as Plotinus suggests, we may start out from the noble and majestic things. I'm highlighting this, noble and majestic things in line 4. And transfer to the good by way of preeminence its intellection, from which must be abstracted all dualities characteristic of the intellect, such as inner outer, original image, subject object, so that the one, I quote, should keep absolutely quiet by itself, being neither thinker nor object of thought in the proper sense. What one is left with after this process of abstraction is superintellection, hypernoesis, which is superior to intellect's dualistic self-contemplation. Or again, we may start from the dynamic, and that's most important for my talk, from dynamic analogies of natural processes to approximate the procession of all things from the one, on the assumption that everything in reality, even the lower levels, imitates the first principle, which is to be thought of as an absolute superabundance of power. But here again, we must abstract all references to temporal becoming and posit that what emerges from the one does so with, I quote, the one not being moved or altered. I'm referring here to Plotinus' theory of double activity, to which I will return later. The list of these analogies from natural processes is impressive, including, among others, those of a stream of water and its source, of light and its radiance, of a tree and its root, of the series of prime numbers arising from or being added to unity, of seed and creature, of center and circle, of fire producing heat, of snow producing cold, or sweet smelling things producing perfumes. And yet, so Plotinus, none of these analogies from natural or mental processes, no act of transference, metapherein that I talked about, and the accompanying abstraction, aphirein, can attain the one which lies incomprehensible beyond thought and language. In Plotinus' words, this is the second passage, we must go along with the words, if in speaking of the good we use of necessity, for the sake of indication, and endeixeos heneka, expressions which we do not, strictly speaking, allow to be used. But one should understand as if with each of them. That's a famous passage because of this as if. Much less commented was this term endeixes that Plotinus uses to capture the purpose of analogies. This term is borrowed from Plato, who in the Statesman asserts that it is a hard thing to indicate endeignis high any of the greatest subjects without using paradigmata, paradigms, where this last word paradigm is not to be taken in a rhetorical sense as a vivid way of communicating a concept, but rather as a heuristic tool that allows to get insight into that which cannot be fully conceptualized or demonstrated. Jens Halfvassen referred in that regard to Hans Blumenberg's absolute metaphors and analogies, which cannot and should not be replaced by the concept. And then Bayerwalter, or more recently Andrew Smith, even argued that some of these absolute analogies, most of all the analogy of incorporeal light, are metaphysically charged despite Plotinus' frequent use of the as-if marker of approximation. I have dwelled for a while on Plotinus, not only because the analogies he employs in his discourse of the one resemble the Gnostic ones, as you will see, but also because the Gnostic discourse of the first principle, for most part conveyed in the form of assertive revelatory accounts, is devoid of the self-reflective pronouncements we have seen in Plotinus. So now that we're finally moving to the Gnostic configuration of analogies, we may wish to keep in mind the following question that stem from Plotinus. What is the epistemological status of the configuration of analogies applied to the Gnostic first principle? Are they just illustrations of the inconceivable illustrant? Or are they employed for the sake of indexes causing the spark of knowledge to leap across from the visible to the invisible? Or is it that, depending on the immediate context, each analogy plays multiple roles, sometimes illustrating, sometimes indicating, and sometimes directly signifying the first principle and its devolution into multiplicity? And are there in this configuration some privileged absolute analogies that go beyond mere approximation, as Bayerwalter asserted to be the case for the Plotinian analogy of light? Let me now move to the Gnostic use of analogies, finally. The majority of analogies deployed by Plotinus can also be found in Gnostic texts too, as well as in other religious, political, religious, philosophical speculations of the period. But as I already mentioned, there are some important analogies in the Gnostic discourse of the first principle and the origin of multiplicity that are conspicuously absent from Plotinus' repertoire. But let us briefly examine what is shared in common. First, these are just a couple of examples. There is this analogy of a tree and its root. Plotinus develops this dynamic analogy in several places to illustrate what is somewhat misleadingly called the double activity of the one, the internal and external. I say misleadingly because the one good is strictly speaking beyond activity. The intellect is the first activity. Individual things, Plotinus says, proceed from this principle while it remains within. I'm reading this passage. They come from it as from a single root which remains static in itself, but they flower out into a divided multiplicity. One is tempted to see in this version of the tree root analogy the imprint of Plato's image of a plant turned upside down from the Timaeus, whose roots are not in earth, I quote, but in the heavens, Timaeus 90a, which Plotinus simply transfers to a higher metaphysical level. Moving now to the opening passage of the tripartite treatise or tractate, the text appears to wish to say something very similar, but in a condensed way, playing simultaneously with heterogeneous images. Here comes the passage. Whatever we can say about the exalted mothers, we must begin with the Father, who is the root of all of the all, and from whom we have received grace to speak about him. He existed before anything else came into being other than him alone. The Father is a single one, being like a number, because he is the first, and he is only himself, but he is not like a solitary one. Otherwise, how would he be a father? For a name follows from father's son. But that single one who is only himself is the Father, being like a root with the tree, branches, and fruit. The Valentinian author conveys the same Plotinian paradox of a transcendent first principle from which all things proceed, while it remains unchanged, by introducing a contrast between being a single one, a monad, and being like a number that is not really being number, when number stands actually, in this case, for multiplicity. The other, so the same paradox of absolute transcendence and and multiplicity that arises from the one is expressed by other images of the sole parent and the root. And they only serve to strengthen this point, which seems to owe something to Neo-Pythagorean monistic speculations. The second and quick example is that is shared by Plotinus and the Gnostics, is that of the sweet-smelling things producing perfumes. For Plotinus, this analogy provides yet another illustration of his central claim that what arises from the one, I read the first passage, what arises from the one arises without its having been moved. Perfume things, says Plotinus, confirm this most clearly. As long as they exist, something proceeds from them, around them, whose presence the bystander enjoys. The presence of the smells, of course, and not of the static source. In the passage from the Gospel of Truth, this same analogy is raised to another level. I don't think I have time to read the whole the whole passage, so you are free to do it. I'm just going to quickly summarize it. The perfume thing here is the Father, from whose bosom comes out his warm perfume, the Son, to awaken the elect whose spirit, pneuma, has grown cold in the soul endowed plasma. His fragrance, it's the context is liturgical, probably baptismal, and the sensorial imagery of the Father's sweetness, his fragrance, its warmth, is opposed to the coldness of the physical existence. All these images can hardly be qualified as merely illustrative. This is one of those examples where the complex images borrowed from multiple heterogeneous traditions, from Paul's sweet aroma of knowledge to the molding of Adam in Genesis 2:7, and the Stoic pneuma cooling down from its original tension, to mention only some, intends not only to arouse emotion, but also to cause a spark of knowledge to leap to the invisible. So analogies as heuristic tools to cause the leap of knowledge, to spark of knowledge to leap from visible to the invisible. My third example is coming from the text I worked most on. The text, this is the master narrative of the so-called Setian Gnostic tradition, the Apocryphon of John. In the initial section of his revelatory monologue, the Savior communicates to John the nature of a solitary first principle in the subsequent unfolding of the spiritual realm. This first principle, as the Savior explains in his poetically intoned apophatic discourse, can neither be grasped by intellect nor articulated by discursive reasoning, but only mediated through evocative analogies. Individual analogies are chosen for their capacity to supply an intuitive insight into the paradox of a transcendent unity, which, while remaining unchanged and simple, externalizes itself into plurality of subordinate levels of reality. All of these analogies, condensed, of course, can be found in the following sections from the Savior's praise of the absolute unity. The monad, inasmuch as it is monarchy and nothing rules over it, is the God and the Father of the entirety, the Holy One, the invisible one, which is above the entirety, which exists in its incorruptibility, existing as pure light into which no eye light is able to gaze. It is spirit, it is light. This is the immeasurable light, the holy and undefiled purity. And it is without need. There is nothing prior to it. It searches for its own self in the fullness of the light. It shall conceive the unmixed light, the immeasurable greatness. It conceives its own self in its own light that surrounds it, the fountain of the living water, delightful of purity. One group of analogies, all taken from the physical domain, portrays the first principle as infinite, indeterminate, and continuous substance. Especially I'm referring to light and water. And also as a continuous substance which naturally contracts and expands. Pneuma, spirit. The second and more diverse group of analogies, reproductive, political, numerological, psychological, emphasizes in turn the irreducible tension within the first principle between the two antagonistic drives of self-preservation and self-differentiation, of rejecting any determination and striving to become an autonomous entity. This self-searching absolute, consider the verb aitain, it searches for its own self, is not the one of Plotinus, who, as he says, is perfect precisely because it seeks nothing. These 7 analogical domains, to which we should also add the Neo-Pythagorean metaphysical numerology, as well as the surface folktale plot, and its set stable of characters on the left, in the left column, the hero, the victim, the villain, the helper. Constitute a paradigmatic semantic repertoire for articulating the emerging hierarchies of the spiritual realm and the eventual appearance of its entropic material residue. Each stage in this process of devolution is conveyed by either a full or selective deployment of available analogous inputs, as shown in this table. An important feature that cannot easily be discerned from the table is the systematic avoidance of the separate development of specific analogies. But this can be easily seen in the previously quoted praise of the first principle, where individual elements of one analogy are always fused with the elements taken from the other, creating almost impenetrable blend of metaphors and resulting in an enigmatic obscurity of the whole discourse of procession. The reasons are clear. On the one hand, we have this idea that, according to the genre convention of the period, divine revelation must be obscure, partly because of its sublime subject matter, and partly because it ought to remain hidden from vulgar cobblers. The value of concealment is also a common theme in philosophical treatises and allegorical commentaries of the period. But the preference for allusive diction and analogical metaphors in the Apocryphon of John cannot just be explained in terms of literary influences. It is the symptom of a mistrust of univocal language of this kind that we saw in Plotinus, and its adequacy to address the metaphysical problematic of the first principle beyond being an intellection. At the end of I'm moving to the final section about the privileged analogies. So in this series of analogies that you see here, is there anyone that is privileged in the same way that Werner Weierwalter's claimed that the analogy of light is privileged and essential analogies for Plotinus? Both Plotinus and Irenaeus, who are the main opponents of the Gnostics in the 2nd century, independently of one another, found unacceptable the Gnostic perspectival shift toward, as Plotinus puts it, the homologation of the separate level of reality. I'm talking about psychology code that I'm highlighting in this column. Plotinus' critique centers on the Gnostic attribution to the universal soul of the same affections as those given to the individual souls. In his word, but to assume starting from the soul, homology with the soul of the all, with the human soul is as if somebody were to take the class of potters and smiths in a well-ordered city and make them a reason for blaming the whole. But one must consider the differences between the universal soul and ours in its management of body, and so on, so on. Plotinus, in other words, rejects as non-Platonic, and he's right on that regard, the Gnostic application of anthropological categories to metaphysical domain. What distinguishes the universal word soul from our soul is that it is not bound by the body, that it never vacillates between the intelligible and the sensible, and that it is therefore remains free of irrational impulses, passions, and misguided deliberation, precisely the qualities of the Gnostic Sophia, who personifies the Gnostic world soul. As Plotinus writes in another chapter of his anti-Gnostic treatise, soul does not exercise control by taking thought, nor does she engage herself in putting to right this or that. Discursive thought, so Plotinus, is proper to the individual souls, which are constantly vacillating between the sensible and intelligible. The Gnostic obliteration of every distinction between the cosmic soul and its individual counterpart poses thus a radical challenge to the very foundation of the Platonic world model. First, by exposing the world soul to our affections and our vacillating thought, it introduces into the higher realm the possibility of error and miscalculation, very much in a very similar way as the one we can find in post-Kantian idealism. And second, it compromises the status of the world governed by this vacillating rational soul. The cosmos is no longer a well-founded copy of the preordered ideal pattern, but a distant semblance of an imperfect rational representation of the intelligible model. This same Gnostic penchant for psychologizing the intelligible realm and the first principle does not stop at the level of the cosmic soul. In his theological polemic against the Gnostics in Book 2 of Against Heresies, Irenaeus points to the inappropriateness of applying such psychologizing analogies to God. Here is the passage. Notice the line 4, indeed, they apply to the Father of all things that occur in humans and declare him to be unknown to all, yet still endowing him with human dispositions and passions. Although not always a reliable summarizer of Gnostic doctrines, Irenaeus accurately summarizes the anthropomorphic fallacy of his Valentinian opponents, as he calls it, the transference of human dispositions and passions to the inner life of God. So, in this particular text here that I partly quoted earlier, we may see actually how the Apocryphon of John, again, applies and adopts human cognitive processes, the guiding analogy to its explanation of the passage from the unity to plurality. We have read the first two lines. It searches, I attain for its own self in the fullness of the light. We are talking about the first principle. And every way it conceived its own image, and its conception became actual and was shown forth. The passage distinguishes three phases in God's self-development. The first phase is that of involution and an obscure self-longing. God searches for himself, but is still unable to discern its reflection in the surrounding light. In the second phase, the gaze becomes focused and we arrive at the moment of God conceiving his specular image in the medium of light. We are very close here to Lacanian mirror phase. Mirror is a metaphor used in another Gnostic text to explain this process. This primary insight entails the process of conceptualizing the specular image. by the end of that phase, God will have examined the specular image so thoroughly and in every way that in the third phase, he will objectify this holistic conception of the self and give his assent to it. This is first thought, or enoia. Although certified by God, this first conception is vague and inadequate. It reflects God's wholeness, but it does not detail his predicative content. The whole ensuing myth, as described by the second book of John, simply represents the further devolution and of this original God self-conception, whereupon this vague and holistic but inadequate image will become the set of predicate through the activity of further emanations, especially nous and logos. A cognitive model that comes close to this peculiar developmental theology is a Platonizing version of the Stoic theory of self-conciliation, of a kind attested by Cicero, but possibly to be traced back to Antiochus of Ascalon. We may find it in the right column, in the left column, sorry, of my slide. Knowledge acquisition in human beings, according to Cicero, is a long-lasting process of stepwise affiliation to reason, which strikingly resembles the sequence of God's mental developments in Gnostic speculations. In Cicero's account, mental faculties emerge only gradually, triggered by their respective objects. The faculty of sense perception by sensible object, and the faculty of discursive reasoning by the need to sort out and systematize the accumulated conceptions. The first stage of cognitive development, the final stage of the cognitive development, is the impregnable knowledge of the world and oneself, a stable condition described as perfected reason or wisdom, sapientia, Sophia. In the rationalist account of Archaeology, the acquisition of impregnable self-knowledge is possible because it rejects the idea of a separate irrational element that opposes reason. This is not the case with the Gnostic first principle, which is beyond intellect and reason. We call the state of involution an obscure self-longing that characterizes the primal phase of God's existence. Thus, God's willful attempt at self-knowledge will gradually disclose not only his positive characteristics, but also the original dark kernel of irrational drives that can never be fully rationalized. This dark side of God's nature, what German idealism later called ground, will be subsequently cut off from the spiritual realm and become the maleficent dark matter, the source of evil in the physical world, for whose externalization God seems to bear ultimate responsibility. And this is why God must inject the humans to let them rectify these deficiencies so that he may realize his own perfection. So at least, in this case, we have slipped from illustrative analogy with potential for indexes to complete identity. Contrary to Plotinus' assertion that when speaking of the one, we actually speak of our own experiences, Gnostic traditions propose exactly the opposite. When speaking of ourselves and our dispositions and experiences, we actually speak of the first principle. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Zlatko, for this terrific presentation, typical of your work in not only posing an interesting problem and offering a new and articulate solution, but doing it with recourse not only to the usual suspects, Nag Hammadi text and Plotinus, but also literary theory, ancient and modern, everything from Cicero to Lacan and Hegel. Questions, comments, outbursts? It's true. Read Zlatko's book. It's a terrific melding of literature, ancient and modern literary theory of philosophy. Questions for Zlatko? Anyone? Feel free to type questions into the chat or raise your hand, and Ninka or I will find you out. As we begin to mull over questions or rattle away on our keyboards, I am happy to begin with a question myself. So if I understood you correctly, Zlatko, your thesis is that while Plotinus talks about our impositions of various analogies on the one, part of the difficulty he has with the Gnostics is that the Gnostics go in the other direction. And so far as we are being conscious individuals in the way that you outlined, I think with this quite brilliant passage from Cicero, the Solus 30, which I like very much. Insofar as we are being conscious, we are actually enacting the consciousness of the first principle itself. Yeah, I strongly agree with this reading of protologies like that found in the Secret Book of John and the Tripartite Tractate. But do you think Plotinus has this general? Do you think Plotinus has this reading of Gnosticism in mind as well? Or is he really just focused on the soul in particular in his treatise against the Gnostics?
Right, he does talk about, Gnostics' tendencies to obliterate the distinction between the visible and the invisible world, right? That would be probably the closest passages, the set of closest, possibly the closest passages where he's really thinking about this Gnostic tendency to anthropomorphize, whatever you want to call it, the divinity, as probably implied into it. Although, of course, he's also thinking about the Gnostics introducing the categories of the physical world into the intelligible world. So both, but I do think actually that especially in combination with Irenaeus, I do think that actually that both of them, did read, although Plotinus not specifically as Irenaeus, the Gnostic homologation of the levels of reality, identification of God with the human cognitive process. Both of them as problematic and starting already with the divinity itself. But you are quite right. There is no clear-cut evidence, right, for Plotinus raising the stakes all the way up to the first principle, as we can see in Irenaeus. Or maybe I'm missing a passage.
No, I don't know of it either. But what this would make me think then, hypothetically speaking, for the sake of discussion, would be that that Plotinus probably doesn't go there with the Gnostics because he has so much to agree about them with. His refutation of Gnostic thought in Aeneid 2:9 is focused on deals with many issues. He has a lot to take up with them, but how one deals with the first principle and conceiving of it does not seem to be an issue there. Maybe in 6:8 with the discussion of the audacious thoughts describing will to the
that
one.
Would be again, but
that would be it.
That would be probably Tolma would be probably the closest we can come. But this what is speaking of Plotinus and Gnostics and their discussion and their views of the first principles. This what I tried to point out at some point. This distinction between the self-searching absolute, right, that kind of engenders to become perfect, as opposed to this totally self-sufficient absolute that engendered simply because he is perfect, right? It is perfect, is something that I consider to actually be that crucial distinction, right, from which Plotinus actually, in a way, is viewpoint from which Plotinus feels obliged to attack the Gnostics and write these polemical treatises against them.
Yeah. Other questions, comments, outbursts? Yes. We have one from Christian Bull. Christian, would you like me to read it, or would you?
Yeah, I
enter
do
the
have,
conversation
Christian.
yourself?
Yeah, maybe you can. Everybody can see it, I guess, but maybe you can read it, Ivan, huh?
Well,
Yeah,
I can read it loud. Now that I'm allowed, I'm giving phone suddenly. Yeah, it's just this fascinating metaphor of the root, which, of course, I recalled the one in Corpus Hermeticum, which seemed fairly close in language, right?
Yeah.
So I've been thinking about that, but I never made a study of it, where this metaphor of the root comes from. There's a similar thing in Asclepius chapter 6, where he talks about that all things endowed with the soul, they have roots leading upwards, whereas inanimate beings have roots coming downwards, right?
Yeah.
So I was just fascinated by this metaphor and was wondering, do you think the Hermetic passage might be the genesis there, or do you think, is there anywhere else you've seen this metaphor? Yeah, there you go.
I mean, to be honest, first of all, I'm amazed by your capacity to immediately pull out this passage. I have it in my footnotes to this talk, of course, and I must say, where did I take it from? I think I don't remember it, from Corpus Hermeticum. I didn't do his word study. I think I found it in Antonio Orbe. So if there is anyone, who, any scholar, right, who would spend a significant amount of time and possibly even write 100 pages long article about the metaphor of root, that would be Antonio Orbe. From mine, I mentioned Plato's Timaeus. That came in first in my mind, but really only when I would expect that to be the case for Plotinus. Right? But I seriously doubt that the Gnostics would go that way. I did my word search, and Riza or root doesn't show up, prominently in that particular way, in the biblical text, right? That's one thing for sure. Now we can look at the clusters, right? Riza, right, always goes together with what else? Monas, right? Monas. And so that if we start thinking about the clusters, then of course, and arche, related to that, then we would probably end up with possibly some kind of Neo-Pythagorean impact or influence. But that's an easy way out of it. So that's all I can tell you about this, interesting thing. So yes, Plato's Timaeus could have been, like, Plotinus really does know Plato back and forth. So we would expect that to be one possible influence. But in the case of the tripartite treatise, besides that, what I just told you and the reference to Corpus Hermeticum, I cannot think of anything else, to be honest.
Oh, I just did a word search now, that it's seems to pop up again in Synesius, in the hymns of Synesius.
You were looking that, okay, Synesius. Yes, this is the stuff for Antonio Orbe. He will probably have all that stuff.
Okay, yeah. And there you also have the source metaphor also, pagon, all right?
Yeah. So, this one thing actually is, as I tried to point out in this talk, what characterizes this, Gnostic and Hermetic, treatises is this apodictic style, which tends to assert rather than explain, right? So allude rather than develop these imagery, right? Like in Plotinus, you can actually read these developed analogies and hope to find something behind that if you really look for the sources, which I sometimes find, really not so gratifying. But in the case of Hermetic writers and especially Gnostics, you are really, they try to show in that passage that I just briefly commented on, for instance, in the Gospel of Truth, there is this idea that, you know, that it is not important to explain, but to evoke, to elicit some kind of emotional, intellectual, or memory response that can only be provoked by accumulation and blending of these images. And this is, I think, you know, what in a way characterizes these two traditions that is common to them, especially for the Gnostics.
Thanks.
Thank you, Christian. Other questions or comments for Zlatko? I think, you know, I'm curious, I mean, to piggyback on where this exchange left off, I'm curious about what you made, Zlatko, coming of the analogy of light and visual, the very abstract but also very visual metaphor of light, and the Gnostic texts you looked at here, with respect to the analysis of Bayervaltus. As you said, Werner Bayervaltus argued that Plotinus has a special privileging of the analogy of light for talking about the world of forms and its relationship to the one. Do you see a similar privileging in Gnostic literature, or does it seem to work differently? What would Bayervaltus, if Bayervaltus had bothered to read the Secret Book of John, what would he have made of it? You know, I mean, and what do you make of his analysis in light of the Gnostic sources? How do these sources ask us to rethink Bayervaltus?
Well, no. So first of all, so does the analogy of light play the same kind of heuristic role in the Secret Book of John? Yes, it does. I guess, you know, because we can in the other Gnostic text, yes, the light, you have Pistis Sophia's looming large in the untitled, in the Bruce Codex untitled treatise. So we do have this constant tendencies to use this powerful image precisely because it allows, you know, this to convey this idea of gradual degradation, devolution, darkening, and also it is also related to this, you know, theory of vision, as we know, you know, that was predominant in antiquity, where it is our eyes that actually emanate the rays of light. So in a way, the light maybe is not only the medium, right, in which everything happens, but also is a sort of, you know, almost a sort of active, right, active energia that can be easily, and Plotinus does so, compared with Gnosis, as you know, right? So basically, light is important in the text that I can now think of in Gnosticism, you know, as one of the guiding metaphors. But interestingly enough, very often, and this is not really something that is typical for the Gnostics, but also for other literature of the period, it is usually combined with pneuma. Not, and sometimes also identified with pneuma. Now Christian can come in and tell us this passage, you know, yeah, from Hermetic fragments, right? You know, where God is really portrayed, right, as right, as what was it, encompassed by His light, right, dwelling in His light and His spirit, right? So this combination of light and spirit. Now we can speculate why this is being done. Clearly, in the case of the Gnostics, you know, there is a pressure on the part of, you know, the reading list. You know, we do have it in Wisdom of Solomon. So this is why, you know, Gnosticism can never be fully, you know, of course, you know, portrayed as a sort of, you know, philosophical, you know, project of, you know, of course, because, you know, they do read, you know, these texts, especially Wisdom of Solomon chapter 7, where you have this, you know, interesting combination of light and spirit. So there is this search for an analogy that would convey at the same time indefiniteness, intermination, right? And also this expansionalist element that, of course, light provides. What pneuma provides is this tension. Plotinus doesn't have space for pneuma, for instance, for his obvious anti-Stoic sentiments, but basically, the pneuma provides, yet another dimension, which is that kind of inner pulsation, expansion, and contraction that supplements this. But it's all in the case of the Gnostics, it's all coming clearly from this intertextual, right, reading of different traditions, including the Christian and early Christian tradition. I think that Thomas can talk about the impact of the Gospel of John, right? Also, in that regard, and and then wisdom literature as well. So, in that regard, light is a very productive analogy. But, and this is the last point. This is what I try to say. If there is something like a privileged analogy in Plotinus, according to Weierwalters, that could be described as light, I would say that in the case of the Gnostics, that privileged analogy is definitely this Antiochus of Ascalon, or Cicero, better to say, or whom they have not read, but this kind of, psychological analogy, which has been abundantly used in his own way by Philo of Alexandria, who is probably, when it comes to this development of typical Gnostic analogies, that they blend it together, the closest relative to the Gnostics.
Yeah, so to sum that up, Plotinus privileges the analogy of light, and the Gnostics privileges cognitive analogy.
As we would expect, yeah.
As we would expect, in line with Philo. We then would see, of course, we see the Gnostics using the analogy of light as well, but not in such a privileged way. Common, but not like Plotinus, and also different with a different kind of mechanics, given their intertextual engagement with, on the one hand, Christianity, especially the Gospel of John, and then on the other hand, the Stoic philosophy with its and both proof texts or texts that Plotinus does not engage.
Right. Yeah, something that, except for that, I took that term privileged from, I guess, absolute metaphors from Blumenberg, and then Jens Halfvassen as well, and then Weierwalters. The problem really is, in the end, to what extent we can talk about privileging. It is just that, it seems that some of the privileging, in the sense of, some of those analogies convey, things, in a kind of more assertive, more convincing way that comes close to the basic idea. And this is the idea of self-transforming God, which, which this cognitive metaphor does in the end, conveys, in their view, much better, especially with regard to what I said last, with regard to salvation, right, and the function of the human beings. Right?
Yeah. Other questions or
something
comments?
That is missing in Plotinus, of course, totally. Right?
No, of course. Other questions or comments before we go to break? Anyone? Jean-Daniel, I saw a clap. That's not a raised hand, right? No, it's a clap. Okay.
Okay. Well, if I may just ask a question about the conclusion of your talk, and thank you very much for your presentation. I'm very glad that you quoted the first lines of the Tractatus Tripartitus, where there's a reference to the Nejasi, the archai. Now, to come back to your understanding of the passage of Irenaeus on Book 2, the criticism of mixing psychology to discussions about intellectual matters. Do you really think that the Gnostics cannot reach the one if they mix psychology, to this their understanding of the relation between what is the upper world and the human world. What do you think of, what you make of this understanding of Irenaeus about this criticism?
Yeah, so your question is, do you think that the Gnostics cannot really reach the one? That's the key. Well, if that's difficult, but you refer to my conclusion. This is the thing. Yes, of course, yeah. If we humans undergo the same process, right, of self-development that ends up in some kind of deadlock, right, and whereupon which, if our process of knowledge, must undergo this, difficult fairy tale like development that goes from ignorance that eventually leads to knowledge, right? This old Greek proverb summarizes it well: "Patri mathos." If we learn by getting lost, right, and if ignorance is a necessary condition for the knowledge, then of course, our path, right, is the same one as the one of God, right? So this is what the Gnostics, I would say, are arguing. So our task, in a way, is to finish the process and and attain to God, right? And we have enough evidence, that this is possible. Yeah, but it is in that process itself that the God, right, finally closes the gap between his own perfection and that dark world, right, which resulted from his misguided thinking. So in a way, there is that kind of what Plotinus called homologia, this kind of almost, I wouldn't call it identity fully, right, but this close resemblance between the humans and God, or the invisible spirit, as you want to call it, or the Father, right, in which we humans are supposed to finish God's job, right? But I'm kind of now coming too close to Hegel, right, or to Schelling, and this is what actually, in a way, prevents me to continue that line, because we need evidence for that. There is some, right? In the text I know best, in the Apocryphon of John, for instance, it is being said that there are these, souls, right, repentant souls sent from the pleroma, right, to rectify the lack where, not here, but over there, right, and this is the same idea of rectification of lack, in the spiritual realm, is also something that the gospel of truth is full of, right? Mm-hmm. So yes, in a way, yes, we humans are there to actually to complete, to sort out, right, rectify the mess that was created by this self-devolving God. But I'm talking about the tendencies. I cannot talk about that, as a sort of, something that, we can find in all Gnostic texts. Definitely not.
I would have thought that if Irenaeus could have read the Tractatus Tripartitus, he would have expressed himself differently.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that's why, I in my blurb, I said, that I'll be examining various Gnostic responses. I have to be more careful. There are some Gnostic responses, which actually mentioned at some point, saying that the so-called Gnostic text, definitely, cannot be even all of them taken as representative of this, radical monism of the kind that we have in Plotinus, because, in some texts it is really hard to distinguish between this one beyond comprehension and intellect, right?
Yeah.
And one is intellect. So,
thank you. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
With all this talk about our human act of rendering fullness to what is empty and immanentizing the eschaton, I cannot think of a better place to end the discussion of Zlatko Plese's wonderful paper. Everyone, please join me once more in thanking Zlatko Plese for his paper. This was terrific, Zlatko. Thank you so much. So here at the workshop Platonisms of Late Antiquity, we believe that Zoom fatigue is a real thing. It's nice to take a break. So I suggest we take 10 minutes, and at 5:20 Central European time, I suppose that would be 11:20 a.m. East Coast in North America, we will come back, and it will be my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Thomas Rasmus. Thank you so much, Zlatko. 10 minutes, everyone.
Thank you.